can we trust the record of nature? Does God tell us that from Scripture?
I think he does, and he does that in many other passages of the Bible as well, that the record of nature is trustworthy, it's reliable, it's part of the revelation that God has given to us. It's a God that can't lie or deceive. So just like with the words of the Bible, what we see in the record of nature is completely trustworthy and reliable and true.
Jason, do you believe that God tells us in Scripture that we can trust the record of nature?
Well, I would say it a little bit differently. I would say that, of course, there's nature out there, and of course that testifies to God's glory and His creative design. I think that's what Psalm 19:1 is indicating. But at the same time, nature isn't true or false, is it? It just is. And now a propositional statement, if I make a statement about something, that statement is true or false, but nature isn't true or false, it simply is. It simply exists. And if we read on in Psalm 19, we find that it actually contrasts nature with the law of the Lord. The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. So it actually contrasts God's general revelation with His verbal, specific revelation given in the Bible.
All right, let me ask you this question then. Did God create in such a way that no tools of science can ever yield real information on the age of the earth, the stars, or the universe?
Well, you know, scientific evidence can certainly shed light on the age of things, but observational science can never prove the age of something because observational science deals with the present. It deals with testable, repeatable processes in the present. You know, when you ask about the age of something, you're not asking a science question, you're asking a history question, aren't you? Because you're asking when did something went in the past. And the best way to answer a history question is to consult a history book. And that's, of course, what we have in the Bible. We have the history book of the universe.
But the history book that we've been talking about, namely the Bible, we've been talking about, does the Bible teach that the word day has different meanings? And you have to go back to the context itself. If Moses used it in 3 different ways in Genesis 1 and 2, then aren't we allowed from the record of nature to find out what God has told us in the record of nature? And my question about the record of nature is, if we are observing the record of nature now and in the past, in other words, you as astronomers, okay, aren't you looking at the past when you look at the sun, the moon, the stars, the galaxies?
Okay, well, a couple of different questions there.
Okay.
The first question, though, dealing with, you know, when we look at the word for day, I would say that it's clear from Scripture, given that it's, again, in a syntagmatic relationship with evening, morning, and number. I would say that those days are ordinary days. That's clear, I would say. And I'm relying on the perspicuity of Scripture. God didn't make the Bible to be confusing. He made it very clear. And so I would say that's clear. Now, when I look out into nature, I find that it confirms what God has said in His Word. If you make the biblical assumptions, that you see, all evidence requires interpretation. Whenever you look at something, you interpret that evidence, and you interpret it in light of your basic framework. And if I use the Bible as my framework, I find that the evidence certainly makes sense. Well, what was your other question then?
Well, let's get a response from Hugh then in terms of the record of nature, and are we observing the past when you astronomers look through your telescope?
Well, I would agree with Jason that you can treat the Bible as a history book, but also argue that the record of nature is a history book. And in terms of astronomy, it's a direct witness of history. I think you said it right. We astronomers don't see the present. We only see the past because it takes light time to travel from these astronomical objects to us. So the beauty of astronomy as a science is we can choose to observe any epoch of history, literally back to the creation event of the universe, and watch the universe grow up with respect to time. So we have a direct witness there. And I would agree, too, that it's a reliable witness. Now, maybe something that would clarify things here is I do agree with both Ken and Jason that the Bible is the only authoritative revelation from God. And the distinction there is that authority rests in a person. The record of nature isn't a person per se. However, that does not mean that the record of nature is any the less trustworthy or reliable compared to the Bible. And just like interpretation is an issue with the record of nature, interpretation is an issue when people come to the text of the Bible. Many people read the Bible and misinterpret it. And I think the reason why God gave us a multiplicity of revelations is that we can check these revelations against one another and use those checks to ferret out the faulty interpretations that might exist on the theological side or the scientific side.
I think there's a big difference here, though. Nature is cursed, and the Bible is not cursed. And we are fallible creatures. And the fact that we have a verbal revelation, which is obviously so much more superior than a non-verbal revelation. In fact, you know, the theologian Berkhoff said you've got to view nature through the eyes of the Bible, because the Bible gives us the history of what's happened. We know that there's been a creation, we know that there's been a fall, we know there's been a flood, we know the event of the Tower of Babel. That history connects the past to the present, and then we can look out at nature and understand it. And, you know, even though we're fallible beings, God programmed us with a language to start with. We have a language. He enabled us to understand language. And the reason you and I can communicate right now, hopefully, is because words have certain meaning and context, which is what the Scripture is. It's words that have meaning and context. And so we take that to the best of our ability, letting Scripture interpret Scripture and letting those words speak to us. And then we look out at nature and we can understand that nature is cursed and sin has affected the world. And I would say, and I'll be interested in Jason's comment, that when you're looking out at the universe, you're really not looking at the past in one sense. We're looking at the present, and there's all sorts of assumptions that we have about what